very clear. Mr. Harper is a bigot. Mr. Harper doesn't like Muslims.
Mr. Khadr, as we all know, pled guilty to very grave crimes, including murder.
Do you have anything to say to Mr. Harper, Prime Minister Harper?
Well, I'm going to have to disappoint him. I'm better than the person he thinks I am.
A new chapter for Omar Khadr and a very public difference of opinion on his return to Canadian life. This week, he tasted freedom for the first time in 13 years, but his legal battles aren't over yet. That's where we start. The Sunday Scrum this week in Ottawa. Glenn McGregor with the Ottawa Citizen joins the CBC's Rosemary Barton. And in Calgary, we're joined by the CBC's David Gray. Hello to you all. Rosie, let's start with that. You know, hearing Dennis Edney, he said this kind of thing before, but, you know, as Omar Khadr walks out of that prison in Alberta, the Prime Minister is a bigot. He doesn't like Muslims. That's strong language. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Stephen Harper would expect anything different from Dennis Edney. He's been battling, this government has been battling Edney and Khadr for years now. So this kind of language from them is hardly surprising. I think the part of the Khadr speaking was far more interesting, probably for Mr. Harper and for the rest of us, frankly. Here's someone that we have been talking about for years. We have seen only in video when he was interrogated. Otherwise, it's court sketches. We haven't seen him or heard him. So just to be able to see him and hear him, I think, was a pretty illuminating moment for Canadians. I don't know that you can reach any conclusions about what you think of Khadr from a short press conference that was obviously well planned, but I think that it does give pause, and I think at very least what it does is create problems for the Harper government, who has propped him up as some sort of symbol of terrorism. So
Glenn, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about the political aspect to Omar Khadr and how the government is responding to all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Rosie that that's the thing that really struck me from his very brief little press conference on his lawyer's driveway, was that he seemed, to the average person just tuning in, a very nice, personable, modest young man. And there's a real schism now between the image that the government has presented for the last 13 or so years that he's been in prison, of a wild-eyed jihadist with, you know, blood dripping from his fangs or something. There was just such a split between that. And I think you saw almost immediately, after that press conference, a change in the tone of the response from the government to him. You still had the public safety minister coming out and calling him a convicted terrorist, as they've repeatedly done again. But I think the rhetoric was a lot softer, and the Prime Minister himself, when he was asked about it, he took that, that excuse that it's before. It's not really an excuse; it's a valid reason. But he's saying the case is before the court, so he can't comment. Although that's never stopped anyone in his government from commenting on Khadr repeatedly before, and it's been before the courts for such a long time. But I think they are sensitive to the fact that people watching that press conference thought he seemed like a nice, contrite guy, and was completely contrary to the image that they had created for him. And that really, I think, has moderated their response.
And, you know, David, what's interesting about all this, well, Alberta is very interesting this week, but what's interesting about this is that a lot of the fight against these alleged terrorists is on Alberta, stopping some of these suspects from going overseas. Some have gone overseas. The focus is on Calgary, to a certain extent in Edmonton, and there Omar Khadr is a free man in Alberta. How's that all playing then?
Sends an interesting message, doesn't it? The line that he said that struck me was when he said, "Freedom is way better than I thought." I'll bet that's true. And I understand, as we've been saying, what a thorn this has been in the side of not only Stephen Harper, but for the Conservatives for years, ever since we first heard about Omar Khadr. But I think for most Canadians, this stopped being a story about politics a long time ago. It's a story about a 28-year-old young man who's been in jail for, 15 years and deserves the same break now that anyone else does who's served their time. Now, that's controversial in some parts of Canada, and we should be clear that he's not really free. Although he's out on bail right now, he's spent years in the justice system, both in Canada and in the United States. How it's playing out in Alberta? Well, like it is everywhere else in the country. It was odd to know that he was in Bowden Penitentiary. It brought the story home for a lot of people who live in the West. But now that he's out, I spoke to a university tutor of his just earlier this week who said, yes, he's a reasonable and thoughtful young man who hopes to make a positive contribution to society. You could say that about anyone coming out of Bowdoin Institution. I think it's an amazing story, and I look forward to seeing what happens next to him.
Rosie, how do you make the opposition's reaction to Omar Khadr? You know, is this a wedge issue between the Liberals, the NDP, and the Conservatives, or what do you think?
It's a very difficult position. I think it was actually easier for the opposition in some ways before Mr. Khadr came out publicly, because they were able to say, you know, he was a child soldier at the time. He was doing what his father told him to do. He was tortured. They say some of those things still now, but I think it's very problematic in terms of the line they want to keep here, right? You don't want to look like you are defending someone, protecting someone, when you don't really know how this is going to end up. I mean, that's the reality of it. So they were very, very cautious on Friday. What the message seemed to be is, unlike the Conservatives, we, the opposition, believe that the justice system can make decisions. And if the judge thinks that this guy can be released with all of these restrictions on him, then so do we. What was interesting was that the government they don't really seem willing to have a conversation about rehabilitation and reintegrating people into society. They just wanted him to stay in jail as long as possible. So, I mean, those are pretty stark, different positions. But I think as long as the opposition stays in the place where they can talk about the justice system and reintegrating him rather than all the other stuff, they'll probably be okay.
And Glenn, do you think Khadr's release will affect how Canadians feel about anti-terror legislation?
It depends how the government tries to frame it. If they continue to use him as some kind of figurehead of an example of the kinds of people they want to imprison and and restrict their rights, so they don't go abroad to commit terror, I think probably there are better examples they could find than him, especially now that he has come out and given this press conference where he seems, as I say, quite personable. And there are lots of other examples. I mean, we have Michael Bibeau, who staged the attack on Parliament Hill in October. John Maguire, who's from Ottawa, who went abroad and we think probably was killed there. And much more striking and strident examples of the kinds of things that the anti-terror legislation is aimed at preventing. So I'm not sure that the Khadr case is going to play all that big a role in the debate over C-51, the anti-terror legislation. And I mean, it looks like it's a fait accompli anyway. So, but I think Rosie's right that also the opposition are being a little bit cautious about playing too much politics with this one.
Let's shift gears and move to the Duffy trial. Some newly released RCMP court documents revealed PMO efforts to contain the spending scandal. Rosemary, what was the biggest revelation in your mind this week?
I mean, it was in large part the narrative that we already knew, right? But it was the details. It's always the details with this case. How deeply involved were Conservative senators in trying to change, alter, clean up this Duffy report around his travel expenses from the get-go? And more critically, in terms of politics, what role did the Prime Minister's office have in directing or encouraging or suggesting to those senators that those things happen? And so that was fleshed out a little bit in those documents this week. And it goes to prove the reason why I sit in that courtroom every day. It's because you never know what is going to happen. And it's coming out in little dribs and drabs. And sometimes it is, tedious being in there and you're bogged down in Senate rules. And then something happens and it drags the politics back into the courtroom. And that was another one of those moments this week. And that's probably the horrifying part of this for the Conservative government, because they have no control over when or how that happens.
So in an email, because you touched on it, February 2013, former PMO Chief of Staff Nigel Wright explained that strategy that Rosie was alluding to. A purpose of this is to put Mike, as in Duffy, in a different bucket and to prevent him from going squirrely in a bunch of weekend panel shows. Is he talking about us, Rosie? No, I don't mean to be glib at all about this. So, but what's going on here exactly, Glenn? Do you think?
Yeah, this was always, and I should say I've been subpoenaed in the Duffy case, so I can't really comment too much on any of the specifics of it, but I've talked about this before any of this happened, and it always struck me that of all the different tentacles of the story, the check from Nigel Wright, or the expenses, or the amount of money he allegedly gave to his personal fitness trainer, the one that I always found the most alarming was the details we got, and this goes back many months into last year when we started learning about this, was the degree to which the Prime Minister's office seemed to be interfering in what we thought was an independent process in the creation of these audits. And the amazing thing about it is it seemed incredibly ham-handed, because anybody could look at the audit and say, hey, how come the audit for Mr. Duffy is so different from the audit for the other senators, Harb and Senator Brazo, who were also subject to the audits. The language was completely different with the Duffy audit, and so it was spectacularly badly done. And I think we're going to see probably as the case continues, you'll see more detail of how badly it was.
That quote, though, I thought, and Katie O'Malley and I were talking about it, it showed so clearly that Nigel Wright really sort of got Mike Duffy and knew what he was potentially dealing with, because he knew that that's exactly what Duffy would do. He would call up someone and he would end up on a show and he would just tell everybody what was happening. And that's what they were scared of.
Yeah. It's something that we like. We love it when politicians give us a call and tell us what's happening. All right. Justin Trudeau told us what's happening when it comes to one of his major planks in his party's platform this week. The Liberals are promising a host of income tax changes, including a new higher tax bracket for those earning more than $200,000 a year, a middle-class tax cut of 1.5 percentage points for those making between around $45,000 and $89,000 a year, boosting the overall payout of child benefits to parents, especially those of small kids. Trudeau says he'll make good on his promise to scrap the income-splitting tax credits for parents that a lot of people are saying it benefits only about 15% of Canadians and wealthier Canadians, and cancel the planned doubling of contribution limits for tax-free savings accounts. The Liberals call this a tax cut, but the Conservatives are attacking it as a tax hike. They can't both be right. David, your province just voted for a government that is going to boost some taxes for the rich, going to boost some corporate taxes. What do you think?
You're assuming people read the platform before they voted here in Alberta. And you could say the same thing about the federal Liberals at the moment. Look, it's interesting to see these proposals come out, mostly because everyone's been wondering what Mr. Trudeau stands for, and it's enlightening to actually see them coming out with some policies. On the income splitting front, I hear often quoted, as you just did, Andrew, the 15% line. It is a popular idea with a whole lot of people who have any hopes of maybe having one person work part-time or be home while somebody else has a full-time job. And the notion of dismissing that as a popular policy of the Conservatives, I think, is a bit of a mistake. I would also argue, quite honestly, people talk about that tax-free savings account. I don't know what Andrew or Rosemary or anybody else out there, but I know I won't be soon opening up an offshore account in some tropical tax haven. But the notion that there's a place where I can put a little bit of money that the taxman can't get to, that's also enormously popular among voters. Sure, not everybody's going to maximize it, but the notion of even of taking away an entitlement once it's given is a difficult platform to run on. I think that's going to cause them more problems than they're aware of at this point.
Are you saying we're entitled to our entitlements? No, I'm just kidding. Quoting a former minister. Yeah, Glenn, what's your take on it?
I thought it was a really shrewd piece of political policy. It puts the government in an awkward position of having to defend either taxing a higher rate of tax for wealthy people, and it also trumps what they think was going to be their big winner in the election campaign, is these giant checks that are going to start rolling out that families are going to be receiving starting in July. So in that way, it was clever. There's still some problems with it, I think. The child benefit system that they've come up with is complicated to figure out exactly how much each family is going to get. The beauty and the simplicity of the Conservative one is you count how many children you have under the age of 6, and multiply that by $160, and that's what you're getting every month, and then $60 for kids between 6 and 17. The Liberal one, we actually had to get a mathematician from the University of Ottawa to come in and to write out a formula for us so we could try and figure out exactly how much it was. And the Liberals seem a little bit caught off guard by this. I would have thought that when they rolled this thing out, they would have had a calculator on their webpage where you could type in your income level, and it's a little bit a harder sell, I think, for them to say on the campaign trail, we're going to give you exactly this much, but they can't say. They can say it's more than you're going to be getting from the Conservatives.
You're saying math is difficult. That's what you're saying, right?
Math is difficult. They also claw back, too.
I know. Rosie, let me ask you, where's the NDP in this?
First of all, I totally agree with Glenn. I think if you can't put it on a bumper sticker in an easy way, it's hard. And I have access to Liberals and ask them, so what am I going to get? I still don't quite understand, and I'm not, I'm sort of aware of these kinds of issues, and I still have trouble figuring out. So I agree. They need some sort of calculator or something on their website to make it clear to everybody. I think what the Liberals did, though, was they went into sort of the conservative realm a little bit with the tax cuttings, which was smart, right? They're trying to grab back some of those people who might be sort of right of center. And then they're still leaving open some of the more progressive vote as well, talking about now what they might do for daycare, which would be means tested as well, so according to the kind of income that you have. I do think, though, that it opens up a little bit of space for the NDP as well, because the NDP's plan is also pretty clear. We're going to create this many daycare spots in this amount of time, and it's going to cost you about $15 a day. That's also a pretty easy slogan. We can argue over whether it's actually possible that they do it, but I think that it contrasts nicely for the NDP, and they'll be able to benefit from that.
David, I was a little worried that it was just going to be the two of us this morning, because last night there was a little press gallery dinner, and perhaps Rosie and Glenn attended that. That's what we're going to talk about next.